There are moments in life when you feel so embarrassed, so publicly humiliated, that you wish the earth would just open up and swallow you whole, and for me, that moment was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of my life. I should have been celebrating with friends, sipping champagne, and feeling like the luckiest woman alive, but instead, I was standing there, watching my mother turn my engagement party into a performance, an opportunity to remind everyone, including me, of how my sister's wedding had been the gold standard of perfection. Linda, my mother, had never hidden the fact that Jessica, my older sister, was her favorite, though she always denied it if someone dared to call her out. Jessica could do no wrong. She was the golden child, the epitome of grace, intelligence, and beauty, at least in my mother's eyes. When Jessica got married, my mother spent a year planning every last detail, ensuring that it was an extravagant, sophisticated affair. It was a wedding out of a magazine, complete with a massive guest list, a designer gown, and imported flowers that cost more than some people's rent for a year. I remember sitting there, watching my mother beam as she spoke about Jessica's wedding, soaking in the compliments, reveling in the admiration, as if she had been the bride herself. So, when Daniel proposed to me, I knew, deep down, that my mother wouldn't be nearly as invested in my wedding as she had been in Jessica's. I thought I had made peace with it. I told myself it was better this way, that I wouldn't have to fight her over details, that I could have the wedding I actually wanted, small and intimate, surrounded by people who truly loved and respected me. What I didn't expect was for her to ruin the very first event meant to celebrate my engagement. The party was held at a cozy restaurant that Daniel and I had chosen because it had meaning to us. It was where we had our first date, where we decided to move in together, where he had first told me he loved me. We had rented out the entire back patio, strung up warm lights, and set up a menu of our favorite dishes. It was intimate, romantic, and personal, exactly what we wanted. But of course, that wasn't good enough for Linda. She arrived late, already annoyed, already judging. She walked in wearing a shimmering gown, overdressed as if she were attending a gala, her expression carefully crafted into one of barely concealed disappointment. She kissed my cheek, gave Daniel an obligatory greeting, and then immediately started making small talk with the guests, her voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Oh, this is cute," she said, her lips pressing together in that tight-lipped smile she always wore when she was forcing herself to be polite. Jessica's engagement party had such an elegant setup, didn't it? So classy. I felt the sting of her words, but I let it go. I had gotten good at letting things go when it came to my mother. But she wasn't done. As the night went on, she continued with little digs, subtle jabs disguised as innocent comments. She compared the food to the lavish catering at Jessica's party, noted how intimate this was in a way that made it clear she meant small, and even made a remark about how she hoped my actual wedding would have more of a wow factor. Then, in front of everyone, she said it, the comment that turned the entire night upside down. She stood there, sipping her wine, and with a sigh that was almost theatrical, she said, "Jessica's wedding was just so much more elegant." The words hung in the air, cutting through the laughter and conversation like a knife. My face burned, my stomach twisted, and I opened my mouth to respond. But before I could say a single word, Daniel, who had been listening quietly all night, finally spoke. He didn't raise his voice, didn't look angry, didn't even break his polite smile. He simply said, "Good thing we're not inviting anyone who doesn't appreciate us." The laughter that followed was immediate, sharp, and loud enough that my mother's face twitched. It wasn't the kind of laughter that came from amusement. It was the kind of laughter that comes when someone has just been called out so perfectly that there's no possible comeback. My mother let out a small, startled chuckle, still believing, in that moment, that Daniel was joking. But then she saw his face. He wasn't joking. He was dead serious. Her smile faltered. "You're kidding," she said, her voice still light, still trying to play along, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're not seriously saying Daniel didn't even blink? Why would we invite someone who doesn't respect us?" The room had gone silent, all eyes flicking between my mother and Daniel. I could see my sister, Jessica, tightening her grip on her champagne glass, looking just as stunned as my mother. I could see my father, who had spent his entire life trying to keep the peace, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of whether to step in. My mother let out a strained laugh. "Oh, come on," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "I was just making an observation. You're not actually saying you wouldn't invite your own mother to your wedding." Daniel turned to me then, and for the first time that night, I saw something shift in his expression. He wasn't just standing up for me. He was waiting for me to stand up for myself. I swallowed hard, my hands curling into fists at my sides. I looked at my mother, at her expectant, slightly irritated expression, and something inside me snapped. "I don't know," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Why should I?" The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in what she had to say. I wasn't going to fight for her approval. I wasn't going to beg for her kindness. She had spent my entire life reminding me that I would never be as good as Jessica. Maybe it was time she learned that I was perfectly fine without her. My mother's face was still frozen in shock, her lips slightly parted, but I didn't wait for her response. I turned away, reaching for Daniel's hand, feeling a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying start to lift. The night wasn't ruined. Not for me. If anything, it had just become the moment I finally started living on my own terms. But if I thought my mother was just going to accept that, I was wrong. Because the next day, she did something even worse. The moment the last guest left the engagement party, my mother stormed toward me with that familiar look of barely contained rage, her heels clicking against the floor with each aggressive step she took, her voice sharp enough to cut glass as she hissed, "You're really not inviting me? Your own mother?" She was standing so close I could smell the expensive perfume she always doused herself in, the same scent she wore to Jessica's wedding, as if that memory needed to be any fresher in my mind. Her lips were pressed into a tight, angry line, but her eyes carried something else, something I had seen before, disbelief that I had actually stood up to her, disbelief that I had finally drawn a line she couldn't just step over. I felt Daniel's presence beside me, his hand resting lightly against my back, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone in this, that for the first time in my life, someone had my back without hesitation, without question, without making me feel guilty for wanting basic respect. I took a slow breath, refusing to let her bait me into an argument that would only go in circles, refusing to let her manipulate me into apologizing for something I wasn't sorry for. "If you can't respect me, you don't need to be there," I said, my voice calmer than I expected, steady in a way that felt foreign but good, like a muscle I hadn't used in years, finally waking up. My mother's eyes narrowed, her fingers tightening around the stem of the champagne flute she hadn't finished, her knuckles turning white as she scoffed, shaking her head like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was the one ruining everything. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath before turning to Jessica, who had been watching from a few feet away with her usual air of condescending amusement, sipping her drink as if my mother and I were two actresses performing a scene for her entertainment. Jessica arched a perfectly sculpted brow before sighing dramatically, her voice dripping with exasperation as she rolled her eyes. "You're overreacting," she said, her tone making it clear she found the whole situation ridiculous, her amusement barely concealed behind a smirk. "Mom's just being mom. She didn't mean anything by it." That was the difference between Jessica and me. She had never needed to fight for my mother's approval because she had always had it, had always been showered in it, had always been held up as the example of everything I supposedly failed to be. She could afford to be indifferent because she had never once experienced what it felt like to be treated as an afterthought, to be compared to someone else over and over until you started wondering if you'd ever be enough. I turned to Daniel, who was still watching silently, waiting for me to decide how to handle this, waiting to follow my lead rather than jumping in to speak for me, and something about that small act, his patience, his respect, his quiet belief in me, gave me the final push I needed. "I'm done," I said simply, more to myself than to them, but my mother's sharp intake of breath told me she had heard every word loud and clear. I didn't wait for a response, didn't stick around to listen to whatever guilt trip she had been preparing in the back of her mind, didn't let Jessica's dismissive snort chip away at my resolve. Daniel and I left the party that night feeling lighter than we should have, considering the situation, but I knew better than to believe it was over, knew better than to think my mother would just let it go. And sure enough, the next morning, my phone buzzed with a notification, an email from a wedding venue I had never contacted, thanking me for finalizing my booking. Confused, I opened the email, my stomach twisting into knots as I read through the details, the words blurring together as the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My mother had gone behind my back and booked a venue for my wedding, completely disregarding everything I had said about wanting something small, intimate, and personal. And the worst part? My name was on the contract. If I wanted to back out, I would owe thousands. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I handed my phone to Daniel, my fingers trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief, my throat tightening as the full weight of what she had done settled over me. "She actually did it," I whispered, my voice barely audible, my hands curling into fists as I struggled to keep my emotions in check. Daniel read the email in silence, his jaw tightening as his eyes flicked back up to meet mine, his expression darkening in a way I had never seen before. "She thinks she can control this," he said slowly, his voice calm but laced with something cold, something dangerous, something that sent a shiver down my spine in the best possible way. "She thinks she can control you." I swallowed hard, my mind racing with the implications, with the sheer audacity of what my mother had done, with the knowledge that she had always believed she could make my decisions for me, that she could steamroll over my boundaries and get away with it. But not this time. Because if she thought I was going to let this go, if she thought I was just going to roll over and accept it, if she thought she had won, she was about to find out exactly how wrong she was. I stood outside my mother's house, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, my breath coming in slow, deliberate inhales as I forced myself to stay calm, to not let the overwhelming rage bubbling inside me take over before I even stepped through the door. The betrayal sat heavy in my chest, a suffocating weight pressing down on me as I replayed the email in my mind. The casual way the venue had thanked me for my booking, as if I had actually agreed to any of this. As if I had been the one to sign away thousands of dollars for a wedding that was nothing like what I wanted. When I finally stepped inside, my mother was already waiting for me in the living room, her posture relaxed, a glass of wine in her perfectly manicured hand, her lips curving into that smug, knowing smile that sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through my veins. Before I could even open my mouth, she sighed dramatically, as if she were already exhausted by a conversation that hadn't even started yet, as if I were being ridiculous for daring to be upset about what she had done. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "I know you're probably feeling a little overwhelmed right now, but trust me, you'll thank me later. This is how a wedding should be." My nails dug into my palms as I forced myself to remain still, to not immediately lash out the way I so desperately wanted to not give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. "You had no right," I said, my voice low, sharp, dangerously close to breaking. "Absolutely no right to do this behind my back." She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head as if I were a naive child who simply didn't understand how the world worked, as if she hadn't just trampled all over my boundaries and expected me to be grateful for it. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "I only did what any good mother would do. I made sure your wedding would be something you can actually be proud of, something that won't embarrass you. You're going to look back on this day and be so glad that I stepped in." I stared at her, my jaw tightening as the full weight of what she had done sank in, as the realization hit me that she had never once considered what I wanted, had never cared about my happiness, had never even thought to ask if this was something I would have agreed to. She had planned this wedding the way she had planned Jessica's, extravagant and over the top, filled with hundreds of guests I barely knew, with a venue so massive it could have hosted a royal gala, with details so meticulously arranged to impress others that there was no room for anything personal, anything real. It was her vision, her dream, her moment to outshine everyone else, to bask in the compliments, to collect the admiration she so desperately craved. Daniel stood beside me, silent but unwavering, his presence a steady force of calm in the middle of the storm raging inside me, his hand hovering near mine, ready to offer support the moment I needed it. I turned to look at him, and in that moment, in the space of a single glance, we both knew what needed to be done. We had two choices: go along with this circus of a wedding and let my mother control every aspect of it, or burn it all down and take back what was rightfully ours. We chose revenge. I took a slow breath, straightening my spine, lifting my chin as I met my mother's gaze head-on, letting her see the shift in my expression, the quiet, unshakable certainty in my eyes. "You know what, Mom?" I said, my lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "You're right. I was overreacting. Thank you for handling everything." Her smirk widened, triumphant, pleased with herself in the worst way, convinced that she had won, that she had successfully backed me into a corner, that I would fall in line the way she had always expected me to. "I knew you'd see reason," she said, taking another sip of her wine, her eyes gleaming with victory. "It's going to be perfect." She had no idea what was coming. The moment we walked out of my mother's house that night, I knew there was no turning back, no room for second-guessing, no chance that I would allow her to bulldoze her way through my life any longer. Daniel and I had made a decision, one that we both knew would leave a mark, one that would teach my mother the kind of lesson she had spent a lifetime avoiding. She had taken everything from me: my autonomy, my voice, my right to have a wedding that actually felt like my own, and in return, we were going to take away the one thing she cared about more than anything else: control. For the next several weeks, we played along so flawlessly that even Jessica, who usually saw through my every move, never suspected a thing. My mother called with updates about floral arrangements, seating charts, and catering menus, and I responded with just the right amount of enthusiasm to keep her convinced that I had finally come to my senses, finally realized that she was right, finally accepted that her vision for my wedding was better than my own. She sent me dress options that cost more than what I made in a year, and I pretended to swoon over them, letting her believe she had successfully molded me into the grateful daughter she had always wanted. I let her think she had won because I needed her to believe she had, needed her so wrapped up in her own self-importance that she never stopped to question whether she was being played. In reality, Daniel and I were planning an entirely different wedding, one that had nothing to do with the elaborate, soulless event my mother had so carefully constructed. We booked a small venue near the beach, a quiet, intimate spot that held meaning for us, a place where we had once spent an entire night just talking under the stars, dreaming about a future that felt entirely our own. We invited only the people who truly mattered, the ones who had never made me feel like an afterthought, the ones who had never treated me like a disappointment, the ones who actually respected me enough to celebrate this moment for what it was. Not some grand spectacle, not some competition with my sister, but a commitment between two people who genuinely loved each other. Every time my mother called to discuss the wedding she thought she was planning, I had to fight back the urge to laugh, had to swallow down the satisfaction that came from knowing she was completely oblivious to what was coming. She had spent her whole life pulling the strings, treating everyone around her like pieces on a board that only she knew how to control, but she had never realized that sometimes the game only works if the other players are willing to play. The night before her wedding, the one she thought was mine, Daniel and I finalized the last step of our plan, the part that would deliver the final blow, the part that would make sure she never forgot the lesson we were about to teach her. At exactly 8 a.m, just as my mother was likely arriving at the massive venue she had rented, expecting to be met with a flurry of last-minute preparations, we sent out a single, carefully worded message to every guest on the list she had so painstakingly curated. Change of plans. Our wedding is at our secret location. Only those who respect us are welcome. I imagined the moment she received it, the confusion that would flicker across her face, the growing horror as she realized what had happened, the dawning awareness that all her efforts, all her planning, all her manipulations had led to absolutely nothing. She would stand there in the empty ballroom, the chandeliers above her casting a hollow glow over a space that should have been filled with laughter and celebration, but instead stood silent, waiting for guests who would never arrive. Jessica would be with her, of course, because where else would she be but by my mother's side, ready to fan the flames of outrage, ready to feed into whatever dramatic, self-pitying narrative my mother would undoubtedly spin about how I had betrayed her. About how I had ruined everything, about how I had proven to be just as selfish and ungrateful as she had always suspected. But for once, it wouldn't matter what she said, because this wasn't about her, wasn't about Jessica, wasn't about proving my worth to a woman who had never once valued me for who I actually was. When my phone rang less than an hour later, I didn't even have to check the screen to know who it was. I could already hear the fury in her voice, the sharp, disbelieving edge of someone who had spent a lifetime getting exactly what they wanted and was now, for the first time, realizing that they had no power left. I let it ring, let it vibrate against the wooden table where it sat next to my bouquet, let the sound of her desperation echo in the background of the laughter that filled the air around me. Because at that moment, I wasn't thinking about my mother, wasn't thinking about the chaos she was undoubtedly unleashing, wasn't thinking about the burning rage that would consume her when she finally accepted that I had outplayed her in the very game she had forced me to play my entire life. I was too busy celebrating my wedding. The fallout from our wedding was immediate, loud, and exactly as dramatic as I had expected, though there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that, for once, my mother had no one else to blame but herself. She had spent years carefully crafting her image, ensuring that everyone saw her as the picture of grace, as the mother who gave endlessly, as the woman who always had the best intentions, but now, for the first time in her life, that illusion was cracking right in front of her. It wasn't just about the wedding, it was about all the years leading up to it, all the times she had dismissed me, all the moments she had made me feel like an afterthought while showering Jessica with endless praise. All the times I had swallowed my frustration and convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than being honest about the way she made me feel. The phone calls started almost immediately, one after another, as my mother did everything in her power to spin the story in her favor, reaching out to every relative she could think of, playing the victim with an expertise that only someone like her could manage. She sobbed into the phone, telling people that I had ruined the most important day of her life, that I had embarrassed her in front of everyone she knew, that I had taken her generosity and thrown it back in her face in the most humiliating way possible. She told them that after everything she had done for me, after all the sacrifices she had made, after all the love she had shown me, this was how I repaid her. She painted herself as the heartbroken mother who had only wanted the best for her daughter, the woman who had gone above and beyond to make sure my wedding was something truly special, only to be blindsided by my cruelty and ungratefulness. But something unexpected happened, something she had never anticipated, something that, deep down, I don't think she had ever truly believed was possible. No one believed her. For the first time in my life, people actually took my side, people who had spent years turning a blind eye to my mother's favoritism, people who had nodded politely as she gushed about Jessica's accomplishments while barely acknowledging mine. People who had once dismissed my hurt as childish insecurity, but were now finally seeing the truth. They weren't just disappointed in her, they were angry. They told her that she had overstepped, that she had disrespected me in ways that were inexcusable, that she had spent too many years treating me like I was less than Jessica, and that it was no surprise I had finally had enough. I could almost picture the moment it hit her, the exact second she realized that her grip on the situation was slipping, that the narrative she had so carefully built over the years was crumbling around her. My mother had always relied on her ability to manipulate those around her, to twist reality until it fit whatever version of the story made her look the best, but now, no one was buying it. No one was rushing to her defense, no one was telling her that I had overreacted, no one was telling me that I owed her an apology. Jessica, of course, was a different story entirely. If my mother's rage was expected, Jessica's absolute fury was something else altogether, something colder, something more final, something that told me there was no coming back from this. She called me once, just once, and the second I answered, I knew exactly where the conversation was headed, knew exactly how this was going to end before she even said a word. "You're unbelievable," she spat, her voice sharp with anger, her breath coming in short, furious bursts like she had been pacing for hours, waiting for the chance to unload all of it onto me. "Mom did everything for you, and you humiliated her like that? You embarrassed our entire family, and for what? Just to prove some stupid point." I had expected her to be angry, had expected her to take my mother's side, had expected the insults and the accusations, but what I hadn't expected was how little it hurt. Maybe once it would have destroyed me, maybe once I would have fought back, tried to explain myself, tried to make her understand why I had done what I did, but now I just felt tired. I exhaled slowly, closing my eyes for a brief moment before answering, my voice quiet but firm. "Mom did all of that for herself," I said, refusing to let her guilt me, refusing to let her twist the truth into something it wasn't. "She didn't care about what I wanted. She never has." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a brief second, I thought maybe, just maybe, she would actually hear me, that she would finally, for the first time in our lives, understand what it had been like to always be second place to her. To always be the one who had to make sacrifices, to always be the one who had to shrink herself so that my mother and Jessica could shine. But then she let out a short, bitter laugh, and I knew that wasn't going to happen. "We're done," she said, her voice cold, distant, final. "Don't ever call me again." The line went dead before I could say anything else, but I didn't try calling her back, didn't try fixing something that had never really been whole to begin with. I stared at my phone for a few seconds before setting it down, exhaling slowly as the weight of it all settled into my chest. I had lost them both, but in a way I had never really had them to begin with, had never really been a part of their world in the way they had been part of each other's. Maybe it should have hurt more. Maybe it should have felt like something inside me had shattered beyond repair, but instead, there was only relief. I had spent my whole life trying to be someone they would love, someone they would choose, someone they would respect, but I wasn't going to do that anymore. I wasn't going to keep waiting for something that was never coming, wasn't going to keep hoping for the approval that was always just out of reach. I was free. But then again, freedom always comes at a price, doesn't it? Maybe I had won, but maybe, just maybe, I had lost something too.